Continuing that side of church history most Christians obviously are not aware of, we continue entering the 20th century, 1900s. The same pattern. God choosing the uneducated, marginalized people in out-of-the-way places. The establishment churches did not receive the moves of God because they were established. That's what made them the established churches. They were established in their doctrines and didn't want to know anything else. They thought they had it all. They knew the truth, and anybody else who differed from them were liars and fakes. But throughout the Bible, we find that the opposite is actually true, and it's true in this history setting as well. Remember, someone said about Jesus, and they said he came from Nazareth. They said, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, the best thing that ever happened to man came out of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. And great things came out of Cane Ridge Revival. What had not been revealed to the wise and learned was being revealed to the simple and the poor. This principle has dominated the Bible from cover to cover. That's the way God moves. Those astonishing events barely attracted the attention of those in the establishment, and those who did hear about some of them dismissed them as ignorant people, hillbillies. Well, some movements backing up a few decades rather. The Methodist circuit riders. See, God was working, spreading the gospel. And one way he did it was the Methodists through John Wesley, they began what was called the circuit riders. They had a horse, no cars back then, like the Pony Express, and the preachers would go travel around from community to community preaching the gospel wherever they had an opening, outside, in churches or wherever. And this was a big event and over a period of time, and the gospel was spread largely through the circuit riders of the Methodist believers and preachers. It was a tough life because half of them died before they each reached the age of 33. You have to be filled with God and truly dedicated to live that kind of life and give your life in that manner. Well, one of those Methodist preachers' name was Francis Asbury. I personally know a preacher friend who went to Asbury Seminary, coming from Francis Asbury, but he came from Europe to the colonies in 1771. Remember, this is a few years before the Declaration of Independence. Lots of things were going on in America during this time to distract people, but God was moving as well. Now, during that time, one person out of every 40 of the total population of the American colonies was a Methodist, largely because of these meetings, like Cane Ridge, and Wesley and George Whitefield and so forth, and the circuit riding preachers. Now, some healing and casting out of demons did happen in some of those meetings, especially Wesley and Whitefield meetings, but it was not a widespread thing, and it didn't catch on during that time, but it did later. Healing continued on in some events to some degree, but remained basically in the background. The official authorities never seemed to get the point. That's throughout the Bible. The establishment, whatever religion, whatever time period, they never get the point. The Pharisees never got the point. Only the common people, hurting people, believed the gospel, but the religious establishment never got the point. They just never got the point, and it's still that way to this very day. In the 20th century, God's patience seemed to have been exhausted, and this time he started so many fires in so many places that no one has yet been able to put them all out. The full Pentecostal experience of fire spread over the world and could not be put out. That one began on New Year's Day, 1901. The Pentecostal revival, 100 years after Cane Ridge. It started in Topeka, Kansas. A small Bible study. And this lady, one of the students, Agnes Osnum, a student in the Bible class directed by Charles Parham in Topeka, Kansas. She had a remarkable spiritual experience. Now, this small class had been studying the book of Acts, and so Agnes felt inspired to pray for the baptism of the Holy Spirit, which they'd been studying about. I've pointed this out in lesson after lesson that all through history, church history, where people would read the Bible and be honest with it, they would come under conviction and start believing what they read in the Bible and get the same things they got in the book of Acts. So she wanted to be prayed for, and she wanted Charles Parham to pray for her, and he did. He said, I laid my hands on her and prayed, and the glory fell upon her. She began speaking the Chinese language, which obviously he recognized, and was unable to speak English for 3 days. Now this is new to them, so it wasn't fake, it wasn't put on. This was the Holy Spirit. Again, an out-of-the-way place by unknown people, God was moving. Well, Parham accepted her experience, Pentecostal experience, and realized and taught that speaking in other tongues was a primary evidence of the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Now, I've pointed out over and over that these people, some of them, almost all of them, made mistakes. They started speculating. Instead of studying the Bible, he came up with this idea or theory that Christian missionaries didn't need to learn any foreign languages. All they needed to do was go around the world and preach the gospel in other tongues, speaking in other tongues, and everyone would automatically understand. But that is not the way it works. After that, Parham moved to Houston, Texas, where he started another Bible class. And people found out about it and started coming. And in that area was an itinerant black preacher named William Seymour. He asked Parham if he could attend the class, Bible class, but Parham was also a Ku Klux Klan sympathizer, refused to allow Seymour to sit inside the classroom with white people. Yes, this racism has been very real in this country, and it still is in some places, but Jesus is an answer to all of that. Well, in spite of all this, Parham knew that Seymour was serious, so he allowed Seymour to sit outside the classroom building with the window open so he could hear what was going on in the class, and he did. Through Parham's teaching, Seymour became convinced of the reality of the present-day experience of the baptism of the Holy Spirit, accompanied with the gift of tongues, and he eventually received it, not at the time. Also about that time, Seymour received an invitation from a Sister Hutchins, a Baptist evangelist, a woman, out in Los Angeles, to come out and work with her. So, Seymour moved to Los Angeles. And from this small beginning, the Azusa Street revival began, which is largely credited for igniting the great Pentecostal movement around the world. They couldn't put this fire out. William Seymour was quiet, unassuming, somewhat disheveled in his appearance, and he was blind in one eye. But soon he got into a theological dispute with this Sister Hutchins, who had invited him there, because he believed speaking in tongues was more important than she did, and so she ousted him. But he continued to organize worship meetings in the simple homes of black domestic servants. God will work with people, rich, poor, male, female, old, young, whoever, educated, not uneducated, whoever is willing, whoever's hungry and willing. And he did here. Then, on April 9, 1906, you might want to remember that date, the power fell. They'd been conducting church meetings and getting together, and the Holy Spirit came upon them on that day, 1906. Seymour himself began praising God in unknown tongues. Almost immediately, the crowd started pouring in, and Seymour and his little group had to find new quarters. They settled on a former church building that had most recently been converted into a livery stable. Well, they did not do publicity, no handbills, no ads, just word of mouth and the Holy Spirit moving on people. A pulpit was constructed with piled up shoe boxes, and the church's seats were formed by planks laid across empty shipping boxes. God starting something new among the poor and uneducated on the wrong side of town, because the established churches wouldn't receive it anyway. There was singing and shouting, praying in tongues. What was even more amazing for that day was the interrelational leadership, and the fact that blacks and whites, men and women, were praying and worshiping together, almost unknown in that day in established churches or anywhere else. Many visitors were impressed at seeing the Spirit break down the traditional racial barriers. Soon newspaper reporters arrived and proceeded to describe whites and blacks mingling in a religious frenzy and carrying on mad orgies. The reporters always added their ideas and concepts and propaganda instead of reporting honestly what was actually going on. Azusa Street was different in that its influence soon spread around the world. Throughout the United States, especially in the South, called the Bible Belt, where I live, and soon flowed overseas. People around the world heard about Azusa Street, what God was doing there, and they traveled long distances in this country and from Europe, etc., to attend the Azusa Street meetings, and then were filled with the Spirit and then carried it back with them in other parts of the world. So Azusa Street revival was not like Cane Ridge. It spread around the world. Now, the revival itself lasted only about 3.5 years, longer than most others had, but it launched the entire Pentecostal movement and resulted in the formation of the classical Pentecostal churches such as the Assemblies of God. So Azusa Street was truly the mustard seed that grew into a mighty tree like the parable Jesus told about. Visitors included many pastors, but most of these ministers, black and white, were from poor, struggling, holiness churches. The established churches, if they noticed at all what was going on, poured scorn on the weird babble of tongues. I hear that to this day among denominational people. But 4 days after the opening of the Azusa Street mission, the city of San Francisco experienced its famous earthquake, followed by a devastating fire that destroyed much of the city. So the devil was out to steal, kill, and destroy wherever he could, but God was working in the spirit realm and establishing this Azusa Street movement, which moved around the world and established the New Testament reality in the church, some of the church, in the world, as it had been in the early days of the church in the book of Acts.